Did you know that tuberculosis is the leading cause of death and infectious disease in the world right now? If you didn't, now you know. Welcome back to Key Lime Academy. Today, we're talking about tuberculosis and its effects on fashion. It should be noted before we get too deep into this that tuberculosis and all the facts that I'm going to share with you about TB are very much real facts. But what I'm going to share with you about tuberculosis and its effect on fashion aren't as much considered facts as the information I'm going to give you about what TB is. A lot of tuberculosis and its effects on fashion are not widely considered something that's proven. A lot of times people consider the effects that TB had on fashion as factors that went into the changes into fashion, but not so much like the solid reason. So a lot of this is just like kind of coincidence, but a lot of fashion historians wonder if these were not the pushes that caused certain changes in the fashion industry. So, disclaimer, think about that as we continue. So, to start out, what is tuberculosis? So, tuberculosis is a very real disease, dates back to the Egyptian times. So, some of the oldest cases of tuberculosis are dated back to that period of time. TB is a disease that affects your lungs and respiratory system, but it's not just that. Like TB is shown to have so many crazy effects on your body. It is an infectious disease, so it is something that is transmittable. TB is transmitted by respiratory droplets, so coughing, sneezing, spitting, sometimes bodily fluids. Tuberculosis is also widely known as consumption. So sometimes you'll hear me refer to tuberculosis as TB, or we're going to say consumption a lot because this disease was known to consume one's body. So that is where the name consumption came from. And this is what it was widely called during like the late 1900s, so that the 1800s time period is when we called tuberculosis consumption. Is shown whenever you do autopsies or you find skeletal remains, you can see the effects of TB on the body that way. Why is my grass currently being mowed? Can't they do this some other time? So as we dive into the different types of TB, there are, you have just like basic tuberculosis, which is your active TB. There's also something called antibiotic resistant TB, and that is a type of tuberculosis that has evolved and is resistant to antibiotic treatment. You also have something called latent TB, which is essentially an inactive TB. So you can be infected with TB and not know until one day you get really sick. Maybe you get COVID, maybe you get mono, you get some sort of sickness. And then all of a sudden, the TB, the latent TB in your body is activated. So a lot of people have latent tuberculosis and just have no clue that they have it until something traumatic happens to their nervous system and their body can't fight back. And then all of a sudden, TB is awoken into their bodies. So there's a few different types of TB. It should be noted that tuberculosis was not identified as an infectious disease or a bacterial infection until 1882 by Robert Koch. And that discovery really pivoted the way that we view tuberculosis, the way that it was treated. Up until that point, nobody had any idea that it was contagious. So TB is one of the most misunderstood infectious diseases out there. That's why I think there's such widespread misinformation about tuberculosis, even to this day. I didn't get this interest in this disease until I read Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. And then that kind of pivoted into me researching, learning about the effects on fashion. I all of a sudden was just like, wow, this disease has been so misconstrued over time. And now here we are. I'm telling you about tuberculosis. Let's get in to TB. What are its symptoms? So with tuberculosis, something that should be noted is that TB has no like physical symptoms and what it does to your body on the outside. So here are your most common symptoms of TB: weight loss, fatigue. The most well-known one is the bloody cough, which you see depicted in modern day literature and movies. You see that bloody cough depicted in so many different forms of media. Some other symptoms that are long-term: You seem to just look tired all of the time. Here's a little fact for you. One infectious person with active TB can affect up to 10 to 15 people per year. Another fact about tuberculosis is that it is one of the only respiratory diseases that can hang stagnant in the air for as long as it can. And I think that's why its infectious rate is so high, because TB, you cough, you sneeze, it's going to hang out. It's going to chill in the air for quite a long time. So there you go. So let's talk a little bit about how tuberculosis came to even affect the fashion industry. So, in the 1850s, or better known as the Victorian era, tuberculosis became known as the creative disease. So, what does that mean? Tuberculosis wasn't identified as a contagious disease until 1882 by Robert Koch. So, at this time, nobody really knows what's causing tuberculosis, and it is causing like a lot of anxiety. They don't know what's causing this. People were scared. People thought the disease was misunderstood. They didn't understand it. Scientists didn't understand it. There was no treatment for tuberculosis other than leeches or getting fresh air. So people were scared because here was this disease and it was killing everybody and they didn't know why. The creative fad was a way to calm and negate the situation. It was a way to give people a cause, and people really dove into that. So, what was the creative disease? When I say that, what do I mean? So, the creative fad was a misconception that tuberculosis targeted people with creative, artistic, and intellectual traits. So, they thought if you were creative, if you were a writer, if you were an artist, a painter, a sculptor, then you were getting TB. So, it was almost a disease that highlighted intellect, which is insane. But it's true. It's not true, but this was true for the time. As this period of the creative fad kind of comes around, people are really starting to glamorize and beautify a poetic death. So at this time, you have a lot of poets that are talking about death. There's a lot of death around people at this time. And so it really becomes something of like, you want to have a beautiful death. And people truly believe that TB was a beautiful death because, like I mentioned before, it didn't truly have a ton of physical attributions to its death process. Therefore, dying of TB wasn't necessarily unattractive. For example, if you had chickenpox, that was not a beautiful death. You were covered in spots, you were itchy, you had decay. So, dying of chickenpox versus dying of TB, one's a lot prettier than the other. So, this was the dawn of the era of consumption chic. That is a term people actually used. This era is called consumption chic era. And what is consumption chic? So, people were trying to replicate what it looked like to die of tuberculosis. So, what does that mean? People were trying to replicate by A, not eating, B, having that glassy, tired looking eyes, and trying to achieve a look of malnourishment. So, at this time, there was a big push in the cosmetic industry. From here, kind of like the 1850s to the early 1900s, the cosmetic industry is first kind of coming around. So, people are using dark eyeshadow, they're using blush to kind of recreate that look of, I'm malnourished, I'm dying of tuberculosis. So, this consumption chic era, how did it affect fashion? The silhouettes of this time were made to be much slimmer because, like we mentioned before, people are trying to achieve that look of fragility, of being eerily thin, of that kind of malnourished look that you would get if you were dying of tuberculosis. So the silhouettes are being very constricted, very tight. You want to look as skinny and as non-existent as possible. So that is one big push. This was done through incredibly tight and unhealthy corseting. So at this time, you're getting kind of like the tightest corsets as possible. So that is what's helping these people achieve like almost like they're missing ribs. At this time, you also were seeing a lot of voluminous frilly skirts and dresses because this created a sense of femininity and fragility. So you wanted really thin, kind of like frilly fabrics that felt like they were maybe going to fall apart. So let's also chat about some famous people that died of tuberculosis. So, famous people that died during the 1850s consumption chic era, you have the Bronte sisters, so Wuthering Heights. You have Edgar Allan Poe, George Orwell, 1984, Animal Farm. John Keats was a famous poet. He also died at this time. Simone Bolivar, just to name a few. Those are some people that died of tuberculosis. And while these people were creatives or people that were intellectual, their deaths are only highlighted because of who they were in history. So, as it seems to clarify the consumption chic era, it just was because that's what people were attached to at this time. So, this truly doesn't mean anything. These are just some people that are to be noted that died during this time of tuberculosis. Because people did not know that this disease was contagious, they really clung to the idea that tuberculosis kind of picked and chose who it decided to infect. And so that's why this disease and the consumption chic era was so easy to believe for these people because they just needed a reason. They needed something to believe in. And if it was going to glamorize their deaths and make them feel better about how many people they were losing at this time, that's what they were going to do to be able to sleep at night. And this era did not change until, like we've brought up a few times already, Robert Koch discovered that it was an infectious disease in 1882. And so once this was discovered, things really changed drastically. Once Koch made this discovery, the overall connotation or the just conversation around tuberculosis changed vastly. People now started to believe and place a negative connotation to it that tuberculosis was inflicted because you were a dirty person or you lived in a dirty side of town or maybe you didn't have the same skin color. Tuberculosis at this time period specifically became a very racist disease. And a lot of times, tuberculosis did occur in areas that were less economically friendly or areas that were dirtier because they didn't have access to proper hygiene. So this was not their fault. But again, as we've seen so often in history, people like to place blame. And so tuberculosis became a disease of race, it became a disease of class. But diseases, especially contagious diseases, don't pick and choose who they choose to infect. So this disease was spreadable. And as I mentioned, it made people think that this disease was infected because you were dirty or you were lesser of a person. This time period for TB reminds me so much of this same kind of instance that happened with AIDS in the 1990s, the 1970s through the 1990s, where AIDS was really misunderstood. So how did this affect fashion? We're moving towards the 1900s at this point. So at this time, prior to this, with the consumption chic era, we had really, really tight corsets. And now people are like, hold up. Low key, tuberculosis is affecting my lungs. And low key, when I wear a corset, I think like that being a little bit constricting, I think it's worsening my lung quality. We began to see corsets having their first kind of era of backlash at this time. So people were like, hey, maybe corsets aren't such a good idea. Maybe we should dial that back. Since tuberculosis was a lung and respiratory disease, people decided that maybe corsets weren't a good idea and were known to worsen TB due to their constricting nature. So something called health corsets began to make their appearance at this time. And health corsets were just corsets, but they were made from cotton mesh materials and a little bit more bendable, breathable. You could move in this corset. So, yes, it helped highlight your shape, but it wasn't so constricting that you found you couldn't breathe or move. Another thing that we see at this time is the length of your hems. So, primarily in skirts and dresses, we find that when we have these long, dragging trains, they tend to bring outside in. So, what that means is your train's dragging around outside, it's getting dirty, it's getting bacteria, it's getting nasty. And then when you come home, you're bringing that nasty inside. So we decided this time to shorten hems. So your skirts are going to get shorter, your dresses are going to get shorter. And you also see this happen for men's trousers. So men kind of get a cropped trouser. And in our current modern age, cropped trousers are really popular. And so you kind of see this for the first time. So you see cropped skirts, you see shorter dresses, and you see those cropped trousers because, again, we want to leave outside outside and not bring outside inside. At this time, we move past the consumption chic and form of aesthetic, and now we want to be clean. We want to do away with thin beards. We want to have clean hair. We don't want to be greasy. We want to be clean cut, clean shaven. So this was because tuberculosis was known to go after those who did not have good hygiene. So hygiene was something that was really, really pushed at this time. You wanted to be clean, clean shaven, no beard, clean hair, clean nails. You wanted to be clean. We're all becoming neat freaks. Something I found this very interesting as well is that at this time there wasn't technically antibiotics or a cure for tuberculosis. So doctors often prescribed you to go away to a warm climate with fresh air. And so a lot of people that were inflicted with TB were moving away to these places in a place that had a better climate. It was warmer, fresher air. Maybe you're close to a body of water. So this was like the number one prescribed cure. And so one thing that is, again, said to be a factor in fashion because of this was the standardization of athleisure wear. Because they were moving to climates that were hotter, they needed fabric and clothes that was more breathable and a little bit more active, something that they weren't going to sweat in. Because at this time, clothes were thick and heavy and layered. So they needed something light and airy and able to breathe. So some believe that this was kind of the spark to athleisure wear in the common people. So at this time, athleisure was something for athletes. People that were competing in sports wore athletic clothing. But this was kind of the first time that it was acceptable for those other people in these warmer climates to wear more athletic clothing. So is this the dawn of athleisure in common people? Maybe. It's interesting to think about, is it not? As the 1900s continue, we start to get amazing scientists who do phenomenal research on tuberculosis, and they start becoming, though these antibiotics were not necessarily good for quite some time, we do start to find slowly a cure to tuberculosis, which is months and months and months of very active treatment to TB through antibiotics, usually multiple kinds of antibiotics. But there, over a long time, there does start to be a cure to TB. And so with the cure to TB, this kind of closes the chapter of tuberculosis's effect on fashion. But you do see over time that this little fad with wanting to look like a certain way or wanting to look sickly or just like malnourished or fragile, that trend does not end. And there are quite a few instances where this is still very present. And so moving into the modern day, around the 1990s, you start to see the heroin chic period. What is the heroin chic period? So this was the age of Kate Moss. This was the age of wanting to look skeletal, wanting to look like runway fashion. So this was kind of the dawn of you need to be so skinny. And this created a widespread epidemic of eating disorders and wanting to have that skeletal figure and not having body positivity. So again, we see a reflection of the consumption period in the 1990s, which was that heroin chic period. In the 2000s, you see the indie sleaze era. So the indie sleaze era was a time that you wanted to appear unkept. You wanted to have a crazy lifestyle. You wanted to look like you hadn't slept in a while. So this was like a period of you kind of were trying to look dirty and like you just like went through some stuff. And so in this period, you were kind of like emo music, emo times. You didn't really wash your hair. You probably wore platform boots. So this is a period where, again, being unkept, being dirty was like kind of a trend. In the 2000s, 2012, you get the Tumblr era, which is a time where it is popular and trendy to look sad and melancholic. You wore oversized clothing to make yourself seem fragile. So you were fragile, emotional, sad. Again, this was a trend of trying to mimic being sick or being fragile. Being sad was like popular. And again, in 2020, you start to see from 2020 until modern day, really, you start to see makeup trends that make you look like a sick girl. So, one of the most popular recent ones was the red makeup around the eye that made you seem sick. And so, really, tuberculosis was not necessarily the lead factor in these changes in fashion, but it is kind of the start to the trends of wanting to look and romanticize experiences that should not be romanticized. And I think this is also a good time to talk about the fact that tuberculosis right now is still the leading cause of death worldwide in infectious disease. So, not only was the glamorization of tuberculosis something that happened back then, but tuberculosis is a disease that is still very current, something that is still happening today. That tons and tons of people do not even know is still a very active disease. One of the things that I notice in John Green's Everything is Tuberculosis is he talks about the country of Sierra Leone. And one thing that he talks about very vividly is that that country is still very much experiencing tuberculosis. It is very much still active and rampant there. Because one quote he says throughout the entirety of the book is that tuberculosis is where the cure is not. So you're seeing these underdeveloped countries that are still running rampant with tuberculosis, and people are dying because of it, because the cure for the disease is not there, because the infrastructure, the economics are not there to support it. So what do you think? Did you learn anything about tuberculosis today? Do you think that it actually affected the future of fashion? Or do you think that it was just a coincidence that these things were happening around this time? I think tuberculosis just needed to be talked about. It was heavy on my mind. That's why I came up with this topic today, why we're even talking about it in the first place. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, tell me I'm cool. Really, boost my morale with this YouTube thing. I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope you learned something about tuberculosis today.